In less than 1 hour, a judge would decide whether Arthur Bell still had the right to own his own life. That was the strange cruelty of the courthouse that morning. A man could survive fire, shrapnel, blindness, and 40 years of nightmares, only to sit on a wooden bench beneath fluorescent lights while strangers in clean suits discussed whether he was still competent enough to keep his home. Outside, rain dragged itself down the courthouse windows in silver lines. Inside, the marble floor shone cold and pale, carrying the sound of shoes, rolling briefcases, whispered arguments, and the soft tapping of Arthur's white cane as he searched for the bench outside courtroom 3. He found it without help. That mattered to him. Arthur Bell did not like being guided by people who confused blindness with helplessness. He lowered himself carefully, one hand on the cane, the other locked around an old canvas satchel pressed tight against his ribs. His coat was army green, worn thin at the elbows, darkened at the shoulders where the rain had soaked through. His face had the stillness of men who had learned not to give pain the satisfaction of showing itself. His eyes, clouded and useless, stared toward the courthouse wall, but his head tilted slightly at every sound. He knew where the clerk stood by the dry click of her keyboard. He knew where the deputy leaned by the leather creak of his belt. He knew when people looked at him and quickly looked away. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, stories about loyalty, forgotten veterans, and the truth that refuses to stay buried, take a moment to subscribe before we step deeper into Arthur Bell's final fight for his name. Arthur had come to court carrying the one thing that could save him, an original green military file tied with a faded cotton cord. He had delivered it the afternoon before to the records window, signing the intake ledger with his slow, drifting signature while a clerk guided his hand to the right line. Inside that file were his service papers, the medical report explaining how the blast had taken his sight, an independent competency evaluation proving his mind remained sharp, and a sealed letter from a Marine named Thomas Cole. Arthur had asked twice whether the file would be safe. The clerk had told him yes. The clerk had said the word safe like it still meant something inside that building. That morning, the file was gone. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Gone. The woman behind the records counter had told him there was no green file under his name. No intake receipt. No military attachment. No sealed letter. When Arthur insisted, her voice softened in that careful way people use when they have already stopped believing you. She told him court mornings could be stressful. She told him older petitioners sometimes remembered things differently. She told him to sit outside courtroom 3 and wait for the hearing to begin. Waiting was exactly what his adopted daughter wanted. Marion Bell arrived 10 minutes later in a gray suit that looked too expensive for a daughter claiming she could barely afford her father's care. She smelled of lavender perfume and cold rain. When she approached Arthur, she placed a hand on his shoulder just long enough for the deputy and clerk to see it. Her fingers were light, almost tender. But when she leaned close, her voice lost every trace of warmth. She told him not to embarrass himself. She told him the judge would only hear what the documents said. She told him that after today, things would finally be handled properly. Properly meant a guardianship order. Properly meant Marion would control his veteran benefits, his bank account, his medical decisions, and the narrow white house at the edge of town where Arthur had lived for 43 years. Properly meant a facility van waiting by evening, a locked room with clean sheets, and strangers calling him confused whenever he asked to go home. Beside Marion stood her attorney, Calvin Price, a man with polished shoes, silver hair, and a calm face that seemed built for winning before the truth had a chance to speak. He carried a black folder filled with documents so clean they looked untouched by human life. According to those pages, Arthur had wandered away from home, forgotten meals, mishandled his benefits, and signed preliminary consent to guardianship. According to those pages, Marion was not trying to take anything from him. She was trying to protect him. Arthur said nothing while they spoke over him. His thumb only moved along the frayed seam of his satchel. Inside, because the real file had vanished, he had almost nothing left. A faded photograph, a rusted dog tag that was not his, a torn slip of paper with the old case number written in blue ink. Small things, breakable things, the kind of things powerful people count on disappearing. Then the courtroom doors opened, and a clerk called his name. Arthur rose too quickly. The satchel slipped from beneath his arm and struck the marble floor. The photograph slid out first, gliding across the wet shine until it stopped beneath the courthouse light. 3 young men stood in the picture beside the burned skeleton of a helicopter. Smoke blurred the sky behind them. One man had his arm around Arthur's shoulder. Another wore a marine patch half hidden under soot. Along the bottom margin, in faded handwriting, were 5 words. Cole owed Bell his life. Arthur heard the photograph fall and bent toward it, searching with trembling fingers. Marion moved faster. Her hand shot down. Not like a daughter saving a memory, but like someone trying to hide evidence before the wrong person saw it. Before she could touch it, the front doors opened again. Cold air rolled through the courthouse hall. Heavy boots stepped onto the marble. Beside them came the quiet, measured click of trained claws. A retired Marine had entered, with an old German shepherd at his side. The dog ignored the crowd, the phones, the deputies, the open courtroom doors until the light touched that photograph. Then the K9 stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. It did not bark. It did not pull. It simply stared at the name written beneath the smoke-stained faces, as if the past had just called out from the floor. I had not come to that courthouse looking for another fight. By then, I had learned that some battles did not wear uniforms, and some of the ugliest ones happened in rooms where everyone kept their voices low. I was there to sign a statement for a former Marine who had gotten into trouble after a bar parking lot argument. A simple errand that should have taken 10 minutes. Walk in, sign the paper, walk out. That was the plan. Ranger and I had lived by plans for years. And after leaving the Corps, I had become even more loyal to them. Plans kept a man from stepping into pain that did not belong to him. Ranger stood at my left side, close enough that his shoulder brushed my knee whenever I stopped. He was older now, gray around the muzzle, one ear slightly notched from a night I still did not like remembering. But age had not made him soft. It had only made him quieter. He no longer wasted movement. He watched before he reacted. He listened before he stepped. People in the courthouse saw a retired German shepherd with a military collar. I saw a partner who had once found hidden explosives under broken concrete, followed blood trails through smoke, and slept beside my cot as if my breathing were still part of his mission. That morning, he had ignored everything a normal dog might notice. The wet coats, the echoing hallway, the nervous hands, the deputy near the courtroom door, the sharp smell of printer ink and old coffee. Ranger took it all in and dismissed it. Then the photograph slid across the marble, and he stopped. So suddenly, the leash went loose in my hand. That was what made me pay attention. A dog that pulls can be curious. A dog that freezes has found something. The old man was bent over, searching the floor with one hand while gripping his white cane with the other. Marion Bell, the woman in the gray suit, moved toward the photograph faster than concern required. Her face still wore the soft mask of a worried daughter. But her hand gave her away. It reached for the picture like a person trying to remove a match before anyone smelled smoke. I got there first. The photograph was worn almost smooth at the edges. 3 young men stood beside the burned frame of a helicopter, their uniforms darkened with soot, their faces too young for whatever they had just survived. One of them had his arm around the blind veteran. Another wore a Marine patch, half hidden under grime. At first, I only felt a strange pressure in my chest, the kind that comes when memory recognizes something before the mind can name it. Then I saw the jawline, the tired eyes, the crooked half-smile I had known from childhood photographs on my father's dresser. Thomas Cole, my father. The words written beneath the picture seemed to rise off the paper. Cole owed Bell his life. For a few seconds, the courthouse around me blurred into sound without meaning. I remembered my father near the end, sitting at the kitchen table with oxygen tubing beneath his nose, speaking once about a battlefield medic named Bell. He had not said much. He never did. Only that the man had gone back into fire when no one ordered him to, and that some deaths were too sacred to put in official reports. I should have asked Arthur Bell everything right then. I should have demanded to know why my father's name was in his satchel and why Marion looked afraid of a photograph. But old training held me in place. You do not charge into a situation because it touches your past. You observe. You count exits. You identify who is afraid, who is angry, and who benefits from confusion. So I helped the veteran stand. His hand found my forearm, used it for balance, then released me immediately. There was pride in that small gesture. Not the loud kind. The kind a man keeps after the world has taken nearly everything else. I returned the photograph to him, and he held it with care. Not against his chest this time, but between both hands, as if he knew the past had just been seen by someone who might understand its weight. Calvin Price approached with the smooth confidence of a man who had made a career out of sounding reasonable. He thanked me without gratitude and explained that Mr. Close, Bell was under court review, that outside conversations could distress him, and that the family was handling a sensitive matter. Price never sounded threatening. That was his skill. He wrapped control in polite language until it looked like concern. Marion stood beside him, her lips pressed together, her eyes moving between my face, the photograph, and Ranger. I almost stepped away. Almost. Then Arthur turned his head toward my voice and asked which Cole I was. The question was quiet, but it struck harder than if he had shouted. I did not answer fast enough. That silence told him something. His fingers tightened around the photograph. Marion noticed and placed a hand on his shoulder again. But this time Ranger moved. He did not lung. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stepped between Marion's hand and Arthur's satchel, lowering his head just enough to make the boundary clear. The deputy shifted near the courtroom door. Price's expression tightened for the first time. I gave Ranger a low command to return to heel. He ignored it. In all our years together, through gunfire, dust storms, black water, and nights when the ground itself felt unsafe, Ranger had never broken a command without reason. Now he stood beside a blind veteran in a county courthouse, nose pointed toward the old canvas satchel, body still as carved stone. Arthur heard the dog's breathing. He tilted his head, listening with the sharpness of a man who had learned to build a world out of sound. Then, almost under his breath, he gave an old K9 field command, clipped and calm, the kind of command that had not been used in common training for decades. Ranger sat instantly, not like a pet obeying a stranger, like a soldier answering someone who had earned the right to speak. The hallway seemed to narrow around us. Price stopped mid-sentence. Marion pulled her hand back. I looked at Ranger, then at Arthur Bell, then at the satchel pressed against his coat. I had walked into that courthouse to sign my name and leave. But my father's ghost had just appeared in a photograph. My dog had chosen a blind veteran over my command. And somewhere inside that canvas bag was a truth powerful enough to frighten people who thought they had already won. Ranger's obedience had kept both of us alive in places where one wrong step could turn a road into fire. So when he ignored my command in the middle of that courthouse hallway, I did not treat it like misbehavior. I treated it like a warning. The leash lay loose between my fingers. Ranger was not pulling toward Arthur Bell out of excitement. He was locked onto something, reading the air the way he had been trained to read rooms where men hid danger behind silence. Calvin Price recovered before anyone else. That was what men like him did. He smoothed his tie, softened his voice, and told the deputy that a military dog was making an elderly petitioner unstable. Marion Bell quickly stepped behind him, one hand pressed to her chest, playing fear for the audience gathered near courtroom 3. She said Arthur was already confused enough. She said the hearing needed to begin before this stranger and his dog made things worse. But Arthur did not look confused. He stood beside the bench with his white cane in one hand and the faded photograph in the other. His face turned toward Ranger's breathing as if the dog had become the only honest sound in the building. I gave Ranger another command. Lower this time. Not for Price. Not for the deputy. Just for him. Ranger rose. But he did not come back to heel. He stepped closer to Arthur's canvas satchel, lowered his gray muzzle, and touched the old cloth once. Then he shifted away from Arthur and angled his head toward the service hallway at the far end of the corridor. His nose worked slowly. He paused beside the bench, then moved toward the record stairwell marked employees only. That was when I saw the clay. A thin streak of red clay had dried near the base of the stairwell door. It was almost nothing. Just a crescent smear half hidden beneath the wet footprints from the public entrance. But it did not belong there. The rain outside had turned the courthouse steps dark and slick. But the front walk was concrete. The public parking lot was black asphalt. Red clay came from behind the building, where the employee lot backed against a construction trench and the soil bled rust-colored mud every time it rained. I crouched and touched the edge of the mark with 2 fingers. It flaked dry against my skin. Red clay, I said. Not from the front steps. Arthur's head turned toward the stairwell. His mouth opened slightly, and I could see him searching through sound and memory. Before he could speak, Price cut in. He told the deputy that I had no authority to inspect court property. He said I was inventing suspicion from dirt on a floor. He said the records office followed procedure and that Arthur's missing file was most likely the product of stress, age, and misunderstanding. Arthur lifted his chin. The man who took my file had mud on one shoe. The hallway went still. Price did not turn around. Marion did. Her eyes moved quickly toward the records desk, then back to Arthur. A small movement, but I caught it. So did Ranger. Arthur continued, his voice steady now. He said the man smelled of cigarettes and rain. He had keys hanging on his left side. One knee was bad, so his step dragged slightly when he walked away from the counter. Arthur had not seen him, but he had heard every piece of him. He remembered the jingle of the keys. He remembered the scrape of the shoe. He remembered the man saying, "Don't worry, Mr. Bell, your file will be safe downstairs." Near the copy machine, Gordon Vale, the records clerk, stopped moving. He was thin, balding, and forgettable in the way guilty men sometimes hope to be. His courthouse badge hung crooked from his belt. His right shoe was clean. His left shoe carried dried red clay along the outer sole. Ranger turned his head toward him. Gordon stepped back too fast. His keys struck the metal filing cabinet behind him with a sharp little crash. Arthur heard it and pointed one trembling finger toward the sound. That's him. Everything broke loose at once. But quietly, because this was still a courthouse and people there knew how to panic in controlled voices. Price said Arthur was guessing. Marion said her father had always been sensitive to sounds and often confused people. Gordon insisted he handled dozens of files every day. The deputy told everyone to calm down. But Ranger had already moved past them. He crossed to the stairwell door, pressed his nose to the gap at the bottom, and went rigid. From somewhere below came a faint mechanical hum. At first, it blended with the building's vents and fluorescent lights. Then the rhythm separated itself. Steady, grinding, hungry, a paper shredder. Arthur's hand tightened around the top of his cane. His face did not collapse. But something behind it did. That machine was not just chewing paper. To him, it was eating the last proof that he had served, suffered, remembered, and remained himself. They said I imagined it. He whispered. They said there was nothing to steal. Ranger scratched once at the locked stairwell door. Not wildly, not like a pet wanting out. Deliberately, like a soldier marking the place where the truth had been dragged underground. I looked at Price, then at Gordon's muddy shoe, then at Marion's gray suit and perfect mask beginning to crack. The stolen file was close, maybe only one floor beneath us, maybe already in the destruction cart. Before we follow Ranger down those stairs and uncover what they were trying to erase, tell me in the comments what you think was really inside Arthur Bell's file and if stories about forgotten veterans and loyal K9s matter to you. Share this story and subscribe, because the next part is where the courthouse stops feeling safe for the people who lied. The locked stairwell door should have stopped us. In a courthouse, locked doors carried more authority than people did. They had signs, codes, rules, and the quiet confidence of a system that expected ordinary citizens to step back when told. But Ranger stayed with his nose pressed to the narrow gap at the bottom, breathing in short, focused pulls. The shredder below kept running, that low mechanical growl rising through the stairwell like something alive and hungry. Deputy Harris moved between me and the door. He was not a bad man. I could see that in the hesitation around his eyes. He had been trained to keep order. And right then, order meant stopping a retired Marine and his K9 from turning a guardianship hearing into a courthouse scandal. His hand hovered near his radio. Behind him, Calvin Price had already found his voice again. This is exactly why Mr. Cast Bell needs protection, Price said. A confused elderly man, an emotional stranger, and a dog reacting to noise in a public building. This is not evidence. This is theater. He said it smoothly, but his eyes kept sliding toward Gordon Vale's shoes. Arthur stood very still beside the bench. His cane was planted in front of him, both hands resting on the handle. He looked frail beneath the white courthouse lights, but his voice did not bend when he spoke. I signed the intake ledger yesterday, he said. Gordon Vale was behind the counter. He guided my hand to the line. The pen skipped halfway through my last name. Gordon swallowed. The sound was small, but Arthur turned toward it. I heard your keys hit the counter. Arthur continued. 3 keys, one heavier than the others. You smelled like cigarettes, rainwater, and peppermint gum. You told me the file would be safe downstairs. Marion Bell let out a tired sigh. the kind meant for an audience. "Dad, please. You do this when you're overwhelmed." Arthur did not answer her. That was the first moment I understood how long she had been using that tone against him. She did not have to shout. She only had to make every true memory sound like a symptom. I asked Deputy Harris for the intake ledger. Price objected before the deputy could respond. He said I had no standing. He said court records were not available for inspection by strangers. He said the hearing was scheduled to begin, and any delay would harm his client's ability to protect her father. That word again, protect. Ranger turned his head from the door and looked at Price. No growl, no threat, just a long, level stare that made the attorney stop speaking one sentence earlier than he wanted to. A young woman near the copy machine shifted her weight. I had noticed her before, though only in pieces, brown cardigan. Courthouse badge. Hands clenched around a stack of forms. Her name tag read Emily Ross. She looked at Arthur. Then at the locked door. Then at Gordon. Fear was moving across her face in waves. "Ms. Ross," I said quietly. "Did you see Mr. Day?" "Bell's file yesterday." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Price turned toward her with a soft smile. "Emily, be careful. You don't want to make a statement you can't support." That was all it took. Not because he threatened her loudly, but because the threat was wrapped in kindness. Emily lowered her eyes. Arthur heard the silence. "It was green," he said, as if speaking to her instead of the room. Old cord around it. Left edge torn. Receipt stapled inside the flap. Emily's hands began to tremble. Deputy Harris saw it too. His expression changed. He radioed for the court administrator, then asked Gordon to produce the intake ledger. Gordon said the ledger was downstairs. Price immediately said no one should enter records without authorization. The more they spoke, the clearer the shape of the lie became. Honest people answer simple questions. Guilty people build fences around them. While they argued, Arthur reached into his satchel and removed the only papers he still had: the faded photograph, the rusted dog tag, and a hospital wristband folded so carefully it looked like a relic. He handed them toward my voice. "The file had the rest," he said. "My service papers, the doctor's evaluation, the trust documents, and the letter from Thomas Cole." My father's name tightened something inside me. I looked down at the photograph again. Thomas Cole stood beside Arthur in smoke-blackened gear. Younger than I had ever known him. Alive, because the blind man in front of me had once walked into fire with working eyes and came out losing them. My father had spoken of a battlefield corpsman only once, near the end of his life. When the medication loosened the old locks in his mind, he said Bell had carried him when the helicopter was cooking off ammunition. He said Bell went back for men who had stopped calling. He said courage did not always look loud. Price was still talking when I opened the copy of Arthur's guardianship packet lying on his own table. He had brought it to bury Arthur with paperwork. Instead, he had brought me the first crack in his case. The medical assessment claimed Arthur had been examined in town on March 14th. The hospital wristband in my hand showed Arthur was admitted to the Veterans Medical Center 200 miles away that same morning. The consent form carried Arthur's signature, but it sat too perfectly on the line. Smooth and centered. Nothing like the uneven signature on the photograph's back. Then I found the witness name, Harold Vance. Deputy Harris leaned closer and went pale. Judge Vance died last winter. For the first time, Price had no answer ready. Emily Ross stepped forward. She did not speak at first. She only slipped a folded yellow note into my palm as she passed. I opened it against my coat. File moved after hours. No judge's order. Green folder placed in disposal cart. Below us. The shredder kept running. Ranger rose before I finished reading. Arthur's missing file had not vanished from memory. It had been carried underground by men with keys, hidden under procedure, and pushed toward the blades before the old veteran could speak for himself. Deputy Harris unlocked the stairwell door. Cold air rolled up from below, smelling of damp concrete, old paper, machine oil, and fear. Ranger stepped forward first, not as a pet chasing a scent, but as a soldier, leading us toward the place where the truth was being destroyed one page at a time. Deputy Harris opened the stairwell door with the look of a man who already knew he was unlocking more than a basement. The cold air came up first, damp and stale, carrying the smell of old paper, concrete dust, machine oil, and something sharper beneath it, fear trying to hide inside procedure. Ranger stepped through before anyone else. His head lowered, his shoulders tightened, and the leash in my hand went slack again. He was not rushing. He was working. The shredder growled somewhere below us. Calvin Price followed 2 steps behind, still trying to sound like the only adult in the building. He told Harris this search was irregular. He said anything found after a disruption would be challenged. He said the court had rules for evidence, and a retired Marine with a dog did not get to rewrite them in the hallway. His voice was calm, but the rhythm had changed. The smoothness was still there, polished and expensive, but now it had cracks around the edges. Gordon Vale came last, and he came unwillingly. His keys shook against his belt with every step. Ranger heard that sound and glanced back once, just long enough to make Gordon grip the handrail. At the bottom of the stairs, the records room opened into rows of metal shelves packed with boxes, old case files, and bankers' cartons marked in fading ink. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, giving the whole place a sick, underwater glow. At the far end of the room, behind a gray partition, an industrial shredder fed on a stack of documents. A disposal cart stood beside it, half full of folders waiting their turn. Ranger went straight to the cart. Gordon moved before he thought. He stepped into Ranger's path with one hand raised, saying those files were scheduled for destruction and not part of any active case. It was the first honest thing his body had done all morning. He moved like a man protecting the exact place he feared someone would look. Ranger stopped inches from him. No bark, no leap, just a low sound from deep in his chest. Quiet enough that it did not echo, strong enough that Gordon backed away without being asked twice. Deputy Harris pointed at the wall. "Stand over there." Gordon obeyed. Price gave a thin smile. "Deputy, this is absurd. Old duplicates are destroyed every week. If Mr. Cole starts pulling random files out of a disposal cart, you'll contaminate court property and create a chain of custody nightmare. Then you'll want witnesses." I said. That shut him up for half a second. Emily Ross had followed us down, pale but steady, with the court administrator behind her. Arthur remained at the top of the stairwell, one hand on the rail, listening to every sound below. He did not ask if we had found anything. He only waited. A man who had been called confused all morning knew better than to beg the truth to hurry. Ranger put one paw against the side of the cart and pushed his muzzle beneath a layer of loose papers. He searched once, twice, then clamped his teeth gently around a cotton cord and pulled. An army green folder slid out. It hit the floor with a soft slap that sounded louder than the shredder. The left edge was torn. The cord was faded. A receipt was stapled inside the flap, signed by Arthur Bell the previous afternoon. For one long second, nobody breathed. The file existed. The file had been logged, The file had been moved to a destruction cart before the hearing that would decide Arthur's future. Price recovered fast, but not fast enough to hide the flash of anger in his eyes. He said a misplaced folder did not prove intent. Marion's concern for her father was still valid. The documents in the courtroom still showed a pattern of decline. He was already rebuilding the lie, page by page, hoping the room would follow the sound of his confidence instead of the evidence on the floor. Then Ranger went back to the cart. He nosed deeper this time, pushing aside old envelopes and outdated notices until another green folder slid loose, then another, then a fourth. Harris opened one and read the name of a retired Navy mechanic who had lost his house 6 months earlier after being declared incompetent. Emily covered her mouth. The administrator took the next file. It belonged to a widowed Army nurse whose benefits had been redirected to a guardian company before her home was sold below market value. The third file contained a real estate transfer form. The buyer's address matched an office suite used by Price's firm. The basement seemed to close in around him. Arthur Bell was not the beginning of the crime. He was the latest name on a list. Elderly veterans, most of them alone, most with steady benefits or small homes, had been pushed through the same pattern emergency petition. Medical evaluation. Missing original file. Guardianship order. Property sale. Clean stamps. Dead witnesses. Smooth signatures. Lives reduced to paperwork, then fed into a machine. Marion came down the stairs suddenly, her face stripped of its courtroom sorrow. She reached for Arthur's folder and said it was private family property. Ranger stepped between her and the file before I moved. He stood square, gray muzzle lifted, old eyes fixed on her hands. She froze. I picked up Arthur's folder and opened it on the records table. Service papers, hospital reports, competency evaluation, trust documents for the Blind Veterans Fund. Then, at the very back, a sealed envelope waited beneath a yellowing sheet of carbon paper. My father's handwriting crossed the front, to be opened only if Arthur Bell is ever called a liar. At the top of the stairs, Arthur lowered his head. He could not see the envelope, but he knew what silence meant. The people who had stolen his file were no longer afraid of him being confused. They were afraid of him being believed. The sealed envelope did not look powerful enough to frighten anyone. It was thin, yellowed at the edges, and soft from age. The kind of thing a person might pass over in a box of old papers without understanding that a whole life could be folded inside it. But when I saw my father's handwriting across the front, the basement seemed to fall silent around me. The shredder was still humming. Gordon Vale was still breathing too fast near the wall. Calvin Price was still trying to rebuild his face into something calm. But none of that mattered for a second. All I could see were the hard, slanted letters my father used on toolboxes, birthday cards, and the last note he ever left for me before the hospital took him away. Deputy Harris carried Arthur's file back upstairs himself. That mattered. It was no longer just an old veteran's memory. It was no longer a stranger's accusation. It was evidence in the hands of the court. Ranger walked beside him all the way to courtroom 3. Close enough to the green folder that no one could reach for it without crossing him first. Marion Bell did not try again. The performance had gone out of her. Without the soft voice and the gray-suited sorrow, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent months calling greed, concern, and control love. Arthur sat at the respondent's table with both hands resting on his cane. When the folder was placed in front of him, his shoulders rose once, slowly, as if he had recognized the weight of it by sound alone. The judge ordered the hearing paused and the recovered file entered into the record. Calvin Price objected immediately. He talked about chain of custody, improper access, contamination, emotional interference. He used every legal phrase he could reach. But for the first time that morning, his words did not control the room. They landed on the wood floor and stayed there. The file opened. The receipt came first. Arthur had signed it the previous afternoon. Exactly as he said. The intake stamp matched the records office. Gordon Vale's initials sat in the corner. Small but clear. Then came the service papers. The medical evacuation report. The Veterans Medical Center records. And the independent competency evaluation from a doctor 200 miles away. Page by page. Arthur Bell returned to himself in front of the court. He was not a confused old man inventing a lost folder. He was a decorated veteran whose file had been removed before the hearing that would have taken away his home. Then Harris placed the forged guardianship packet beside the originals. The lies looked different when they had to sit next to the truth. The medical assessment claimed Arthur had been examined in town on a day he was already admitted to the Veterans Hospital. The consent signature was too clean, too centered, two-sided. The witness line carried the name of Judge Harold Vance, a man who had been dead for months before the document was supposedly signed. Even the judge stopped writing when that detail was read aloud. Emily Ross stood next. Her voice shook, but she did not sit down. She told the court that Price had called after hours and requested Arthur's green file be pulled for correction. She said Gordon moved it to the basement before the courthouse opened. She said she had seen other files disappear the same way, all connected to elderly veterans, emergency guardianships, and properties later sold through companies tied to Price's office. By the time she finished, Marion was staring at the table, and Price no longer looked at anyone directly. The judge gave permission to open my father's envelope. I slid one finger beneath the brittle flap. Inside was a letter and a carbon copy of an old military recommendation that had never reached Arthur. My father had written only what needed to be said. He wrote that Arthur Bell had gone into a burning aircraft when ammunition was cooking off around him. He wrote that Arthur pulled him out by the collar, went back for 2 more men, and stayed with the wounded until evacuation arrived. He wrote that the blast which stole Arthur's sight came after Arthur had already saved lives no one else could reach. At the bottom, in ink darkened by time, my father had left one final line. If this man is ever forced to prove his honor to people who were not there to see it, let my name stand beside his. Arthur lowered his head, not in shame, not in defeat. It was the weight of being believed after years of carrying the truth alone. Ranger rose without a command and crossed the room. He placed his gray muzzle against Arthur's knee. The old veteran's hand found him, and his fingers closed gently in the fur between Ranger's ears. The guardianship petition was suspended on the spot. Arthur's benefits, home, and medical decisions remained under his control. Price was ordered to surrender his files and escorted out by state investigators before the rain stopped. Gordon Vale was taken separately. Marion lost all authority to act on Arthur's behalf. The Veterans Fund was frozen for protection, not seizure. 6 other cases were reopened before evening. And by the next morning, the real estate company behind the property transfers had become part of a criminal investigation. 3 days later, I drove Arthur home. His little white house stood at the edge of town with a sagging porch, a faded flag by the door, and rainwater shining on the steps. Arthur knew the path without help. 7 steps to the walk, 3 boards before the porch creaked, 1 brass knob worn smooth by 43 years of coming back alive. Inside, I placed the green file on his kitchen table beside the photograph, the rusted dog tag, and my father's letter. Arthur touched each one slowly, not reading paper, but reclaiming pieces of a life others had tried to erase. That evening, light filled the front window of Arthur Bell's house again. Ranger slept at his feet, I stood in the doorway and understood that my father had not left me a debt. He had left me a direction. Some lies hide behind stamps. Sweet and soft voices, but loyalty remembers the scent of truth. Even after decades, and that day, an old K9 followed it through rain, locked doors, and fear until a blind veteran's honor finally came home. Thank you for staying with Arthur, Ranger, and me until the end of this story. If it moved you, leave a comment for the veterans who are still waiting to be believed. Share it with someone who values loyalty. And subscribe to support the channel and hear the next story when it arrives.